Wonderful. Okay, I can share my screen if we're all set to go. That sound good?
Here we are. Jackson, take it away. Help her with the screen share.
Okay, I got it, I think. Let's see, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes. And it looks like a slide that might be relevant to what we're talking about. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me today. I'm really happy to be here to talk about our work on the Willapa Waterbird survey, which is designed to understand habitat suitability for birds that are using the bay. And you can see it's a big collaborative effort. We have lots of folks from my field station. I'm part of the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. And we're collaborating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, both the Willapa National Wildlife Refuge, but also inventory and monitoring and migratory birds and habitat. So Will, Ritchie, Jackie Ferrier, Khem, and Vanessa, who I think you heard from earlier, and probably all folks that you all know and love. And then, of course, this survey couldn't be possible without a huge group of very dedicated volunteers that are trained to work on the survey and that have been supporting it throughout the time that it's been going. So with that, let's see. Oh, how's that? Can you see another slide? Just let me know if things don't seem to be advancing because I can't see what you're seeing right now. So
yes, your slide came in.
Okay. Okay, so as many of you probably know, shallow coastal estuaries are critical wintering areas and stopover areas for migratory birds. And this is largely because they're using the tidal flats and shallow subtidal shoals as foraging areas, both to help them survive over winter, but also to fuel migration and ultimate reproduction in the places where they nest. And so this is just kind of a little map showing you some of the important stopover areas along the Pacific Flyway, which, you know, it's San Francisco Bay, where I work most of the time. I don't know if I relayed that that's where the Western Ecological Research Center is. And here in Washington, where you folks are, and you have some very important estuaries, and then all the way up through Alaska and the Yukon Delta. And it's not just single estuaries that birds are relying on. As I tried to show you in the past slide, birds are relying on these networks of interconnected sites to build stores during migration. And so that's evident here in this graph of Western sandpiper plasma triglycerides or lipids. And you can see that those are increasing as birds go from Mexico to Alaska along the Flyway. We also know that species show really high fidelity to wintering and stopover sites. So they're reusing them year after year. And that means that, you know, these sites are of utmost importance to them, and it's important to keep them available to the birds. So we see that both in waterfowl from some work that we did on surf scoters showing repeated patterns by the same bird. But also there's great information from species that you know and love in Willapa and Gray's Harbor, the work by Joe Buchanan on red knot showing the incredible site fidelity of these species. And we think that's all related largely to predictable prey resources. So birds know that they have these places to go year after year that will provide the resources that they need to fuel them. But we all know that these estuaries are changing. I always like to juxtapose these two pictures. when I talk about Willapa, because this is kind of, down at the bottom where I'm used to working much of the time in San Francisco Bay. And here's the beautiful Willapa Bay. So, you can see why I like to come up and work in Willapa a lot. But you can also see that birds kind of encounter very different conditions as they migrate along the Flyway. However, all these estuaries are extremely important to birds, and, San Francisco Bay supports a huge number of birds, as does Willapa. But we're losing habitat. There's the worldwide loss of intertidal flats, both from reclamation of flats and just changes in subtidal habitat. And that's been associated with declining waterbird populations. We also have issues like invasive species. Estuaries are a place where people and commerce happens more frequently, perhaps, than other parts of other landlocked areas. So we get a lot of invasive species making their first entry into countries through estuaries. Estuaries are prone to oil spills and contamination, human disturbance, and of course, the many effects of climate change. So what about Willapa? Willapa is, as many of you know, a critical stopover and staging area for Pacific Flyway birds. It's important for waterfowl, and some of the more abundant species that we get are widgeon, mallard, Canada geese, brant, and a lot of the diving duck and sea ducks that use the Pacific Flyway. Excuse me, I'm a water drinker while I talk. Willapa is also part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network because of the large number of shorebirds that migrate through, including about 10% of the Pacific Flyway population of dowitcher, short-billed dowitcher, red knot, and dunlin. And we know that Willapa Bay is changing too. We're getting changes in the population of burrowing shrimp, as Brett and others can well tell you. And these species can engineer the mudflat and potentially change habitat for waterbirds. And we also have species invasions such as Japanese eelgrass and cordgrass. But on the other hand, we have restoration in Willapa Bay, and that's expected to potentially benefit a wide variety of waterfowl and shorebirds and kind of release them from some of these stressors. So that brings us to our project. Excuse me. This is a study that is, as I pointed out, collaborative between USGS and the Fish and Wildlife Service through a program called the SSP, or the Science Support Program, in which the USGS does research that will benefit Fish and Wildlife Service and the species that they manage. And so Willapa, sorry, I'm having so much trouble talking today. Must have been that soccer game. But, the refuge was established in 1937 specifically to protect migratory birds, but they've never really had a comprehensive avian survey protocol, and they've not, been able to collect baseline data on bird populations because of that. So first and foremost, they just needed kind of a consistent protocol so that they could track what's happening on the refuge, including, looking at the efficacy of the restoration projects that they're doing. But then just kind of assessing the impacts of the changes that are going on in the estuary on waterbird populations. So the goals of and implement that comprehensive survey method so that the refuge can have it now and into the future to try to start tracking avian use of the bay. And then kind of our second overall goal was to use these data, the first few years of these data that were being collected in concert with existing and newly collected habitat data to model habitat suitability of Willapa for the various avian species that use it. So to really understand what they need and what they're avoiding in the estuary. So this is how we're accomplishing those goals, kind of our objectives. In year one, we really did a deep dive into what data already exists from the perspective of, habitat information. And as Doug mentioned in the beginning, there's been a lot of research in Willapa Bay, so there is a rich history of information, including, spatial information on parameters like sediments, habitat type, eelgrass cover, burrowing shrimp and other invertebrate populations that many of you on the Zoom today have probably collected. So that was really great, and that will be used. Much of that will be used in the modeling that we'll be doing soon. But we did find that the eelgrass, especially the invasive eelgrass population, changes so much across the year that we felt that we needed to measure that seasonally. Excuse me. And then in years 1 through 3, we're developing and implementing the avian survey. And then the last year of the study is when, which is basically now, we're working on habitat suitability modeling. So some of the things we needed to consider for the survey. First, we wanted something that could track the abundance and habitat use of most of the water birds of interest in Willapa Bay. And we wanted something that allowed the refuge to make the best use of the staff that they don't have. They're not, they don't have unlimited resources and time to do this survey. So that's why one of the reasons that we really drew on the wonderful volunteer community that's in Willapa, with folks that are very skilled at doing bird work in the first place. So that's been very helpful. Another one of our goals when we started out was to make this into something that could be transitioned ultimately into a UAS or drone-based survey. However, that I think we worked on that at the beginning of the survey, but the finding was that the distance that the drone has to go across the mudflat and the timing that the amount of time it has to be out there is too long for current drone technology. So that's something we're actively working on in other projects in San Francisco Bay. And I hope that ultimately that will be a development that we can use in other places along the Flyway. But it wasn't part of this survey in the end. We wanted a survey framework and methodology that can be applied across other similar estuaries in the Pacific Flyway. And that was something that was really important to Fish and Wildlife Inventory and Monitoring, since they have, this need in many places across their region. And lastly, we just wanted it to be compatible with regional and national surveys that are out there. Because, when Fish and Wildlife Service gets a call, like, can you, provide this information that we can concatenate with these other surveys, that it would be applicable and that they could provide those data. So site selection, we ended up going with a stratified random design so that we could make sure that we had enough samples in the habitats that we were really interested in, or the kind of the large habitat strata. So that was just plain old mudflat with no structure or vegetation, and then eelgrass, and then aquaculture. And so what we did in those strata was choose, for each of those strata, we chose 5 sites randomly around the bay. And so these waffle shaped spots are our survey locations. And each of those is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And so here it is close up for one of the sites. And what happens is that volunteers and staff are counting birds in each of these gridded survey zones. So the observer stands always in the same place and at the kind of same height. And we try to match up observers to the same location time after time. That's not always possible. But we're recording species of bird, the number of bird, and the behavior of foraging or roosting in each of these grids. And the timing is optimized to capture use by the most waterbird species at the site. So, and that is basically on a falling tide. We start the survey on a falling tide so that we get shorebird and waterfowl use of the site. So for the habitat data, what we're doing is collecting this seasonally to capture basically that change in eelgrass coverage, but also, other habitat features if they change. And this is some drone-based imagery where you can really pick out some of the habitat features. These are old aquaculture shell mounds, I think, kind of just a small part of this survey area. And then you can see areas where we had native eelgrass, and then higher up in the intertidal is the Marina japonica, the invasive eelgrass. What we ended up going with is an aerial survey via photogrammetry after considering a range of options, because we felt like that was really the most coverage at the spatial resolution that we needed. And then the other data we're collecting is water level data, but this is much more frequent. These are loggers around the bay that collect data every 6 minutes. And that's because we want to link in the actual tidal height at the time that we did the survey. So we're adjusting, the water level information that's at the mouth of Willapa Bay to be more localized to the sites where we're doing the survey. And of course, with that habitat information that we're collecting from the airplane, we have to ground truth it to make sure that we know what we're seeing. So this is an effort that's been done every season with Fish and Wildlife Service. So here's a nice picture of Will and Khem and our crew out, and Fish and Wildlife Service graciously takes us out on their airboats, and we go through and collect data on the cover and location of eelgrass and other habitat features so we can compare it to the aerial imagery. And then this is kind of how the sausage gets made, or so they say. Basically, we take the imagery and it's classified through a series of steps that I won't go into in ArcGIS, but it has taken 2 interns 2 summers each to classify all the data that we have, and basically come out for every survey with a habitat classification map that we can associate with our bird data. And then what happens is all the bird data that folks collect get associated to these grids and the habitat information in them. We model it. And what we come out with, and this is not the prettiest example, but is a habitat suitability map that shows us, the probability of birds using areas with different habitat features. So that's kind of maybe a deep dive or not deep dive into how we're collecting the data and what we're doing. As I said, we've just wrapped up the data collection for the modeling portion. And so we're just delving into the data now. So I was just going to give you kind of a snapshot of some of our results, mostly, bird summaries of the bird data. So just across the whole survey period, I wanted to just share some fun facts. The total number of birds that have been counted are just over 300,000. The number of species that have been observed is 82 overall. We've logged over 500 volunteer hours. And we've been lucky enough to have 23 citizen scientists volunteer with us on this survey, in addition to all the other staff time that's gone into it. So this graph is just one looking at seasonal mean abundance of birds and different guilds of birds. And you can see everything is really driven by shorebirds and waterfowl here. In our survey areas, we have some fish-eating birds and wading birds, but they're little teeny up here on the top. And then we also record raptors and corvids just to try to understand disturbance and disturbance effects from those types of birds on water birds. So things to note here, I think, in fall, we're seeing a lot more waterfowl than we do in spring when our numbers are more driven by shorebirds. In 2020, this really only represents March because as soon as we got home from the March survey, COVID really hit full force and it shut down our work for the rest of spring. But luckily, and with a little help from Fish and Wildlife Service, we were able to get back on track for fall and then also complete a spring of 2021 survey, which we initially weren't funded to do, but that gave us more spring data, which was really important. So here's looking at the data, just the mean monthly abundance. And I just wanted to show you this so you get a sense of the pattern of the birds moving through. And this shouldn't be a surprise to you. All of you sitting out on Willapa Bay probably see this pattern of abundance where, things start off slowly in September. It's mostly waterfowl. And then as you climb through November, that's your peak month for birds on the bay. And then in spring, of course, you're seeing migrants pass through and getting down to really low numbers in May. And then, there's all different ways we can look at these data. We can get drilled down and look at them, by site, by, overall numbers in the bay, like I just showed you. And even down to, the grid level at each of these sites. But this is just looking at diversity and then abundance by site. And you see all these different codes match up with the sites on the map. So some of our sites where we see the highest abundance of birds are MUC up here in the mid to northern part of the estuary, ZOG, which is over at Ledbetter. And then the sites where we see the greatest number of species or the highest diversity tend to be sites that are towards the mouth of the estuary, perhaps because we're getting quite a mix of habitats up there and different species coming in that might be more ocean influenced as well. And then one other thing I wanted to point out, which you probably all know, is that Dunlin just really dominate the shorebird community that we're seeing. And for waterfowl, it's a lot of northern pintail. And the last thing I wanted to show you, and this I did really hurriedly last night, so it's not done in a nice, geographic information system format. I just kind of laid squares over our survey sites. But what I wanted to show you here is that these are mean fall abundances of shorebirds and waterfowl at one site. And so you can see that the use of these sites is very different across these two guilds. And then this is where we're really getting to the level at which we can link in habitat data and start to understand how birds are using different habitats. So just kind of wanted to give you a flavor of what the data are looking at, at multiple scales. And as I said, we're going to be working on the modeling throughout this year. The data are collected, and this should be habitat classification. That's all been completed. right now we're doing the modeling and the write-up with hoping to have a draft next summer. The refuge is going to continue the survey effort to help them, just have that baseline data and understand use of Willapa Bay. There's still a need to have trained volunteers. We are starting a new study. We actually just got back from collecting data there. This is a much more focal look to try to help evaluate the impact of the burrowing shrimp on waterbird and fish prey resources in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. So there's a lot of great research going on right now on the burrowing shrimp from many groups. And this study is just to try to look at how the shrimp might be influencing the energy and prey community that's available for birds and fish. So that's an effort that we're just getting started on. I did want to throw in this call to action. If you were interested in volunteering to survey, our work on the survey is over from relating to the modeling, but the refuge still is going to carry this on. And they will need folks to help them. So we've taken a little pause to try to identify the most important places or timing that the refuge can take to carry on this survey without, involvement by us and our staff. But they are going to need surveys. And so if you're interested, there's a lot of training provided. So, basically it's nice to have some previous birding experience, but we will train you on all the methodology and everything else associated. And you can, throw Will under the bus that you could contact him and I can provide his information if you're interested in getting involved. It's really fun and it's, as you all know, it's really beautiful to sit out there and work with the birds. So that's all I have. Thanks for listening. And again, I just really want to thank all the folks that have volunteered on the survey over these past few years. I mean, it's really made a difference and none of these data could be collected without you. And hopefully, next year you'll be seeing the fruits of your labor. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions or?
This is Doug, and I have a couple of questions. One is that I assume that you are coordinating a little bit with Curtis Regner from NOAA and his drone technology, surveying both. He was going to do burrowing shrimp here, but he has done vegetation in the past. And I think he has more advanced drones than other people have had for a while. So I'm interested in that question because Curtis was supposed to speak today, but due to a mix-up on my part, he's not. But we're going to have him in January when we have another conference.
Oh, great. Yeah, actually, I was hoping to catch his talk. So I have coordinated with him once, and I think that was through Brett as well. And we all talked about the potential of, at that time, I think we were talking more about using hyperspectral and looking at the eelgrass and other habitat features. And I know he's made great advances there. Yeah, I think just for this project, the number of times that we went out to look at the habitat and the scale, that we were able to afford, I think is what limited us with using drones here. But, we are working on, I'm just starting like a 5-year study to try to use UAS to identify birds. So it's a lot of, taking the imagery that you get and then using basically like machine learning, which is not my thing, to identify the birds. And I think, that technology is advancing so rapidly. And in some cases, they're already using it, like for places like, colonies of birds where, they're static and, you can just, fly over and, count and things like that. It's already is being used and is with great success. So it's coming and very soon. And I think, it's just a matter of getting it right so that you're not creating a disturbance issue, but you're improving your count information. Is just being able to look down on the birds like that is amazing. It's much better information. So I'm looking forward to that.
I have another question too, and I asked this question earlier, but last year when I counted the mallards in front of my house, I live right at the confluence of the Nassau River and Willapa Bay. And there were in the neighborhood of 2,000 mallards in my front yard.
Wow.
And I used to be a statistician, so I did the little more sophisticated kind of counting of that. And this year, almost nothing has shown up until just recently, and it's nowhere near those numbers. And I just wondered if you had any insight at what was going on with mallards this year, if they're just coming a little later or what?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if I have insight on mallards particular this year, but I think, what's happened with the drought and the really dry conditions has really mixed up the timing of a lot of things. This year even more so than last year, just because things have gotten even more severe. So that could be part of it. They're changing up things a little bit, their timing, because of that. So yeah, I mean, that's the great mystery, right, of working in estuaries and being like, wait, the pattern, there's definitely this high fidelity, but the timing can really change depending on, factors that are not, proximate, right, to your estuary, right? Like something happening elsewhere in the flyway. So
yeah, I'd like to make one other comment too. I work with another group that is interested in blue carbon. And one of the findings that they have put forward is that these tidal estuaries, especially if they're forested, are one of the best carbon sinks for anything. They're better than the rainforest. And that group is kind of looking at whether or not they can develop some policies to protect and encourage the carbon sink in those areas. And I really like that idea. I like being able to contribute to it. I have 2 little forested tidal streams coming through my property. So I just kind of wanted to mention that to light people up, because I think we're going to have some presentation on blue carbon at our January presentations.
Great. Oh, I would really like to see that, because I know that there's a flex tower in Willapa, but I haven't been too connected to, what's happening with that tower. But in the area that we're working at the Nisqually, at the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge, we had a carbon flex tower, and we looked at carbon contributions to the fish food web there. That's some other work we're doing. And it was actually, the idea was looking at what carbon is stored in a restoring wetland and what kind of food is produced from that carbon, basically, for these fish that they're trying to restore. And the results were really fascinating, that these restoring wetlands can actually store carbon, even though they're not terribly vegetated yet, and that they're producing a lot of food for these fish. So that's, a little bit, there is also data on the tidal forests in that estuary too, and the food that they produce, and they're a really important part of the system. And there's a lot of interest there in measuring the carbon in those tidal forests, but it hasn't really happened that far back yet. So, yeah, that's really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, you will. It's January.
I'll have to come in January for sure.
Well, I wanted to chime in and thank Susan for hustling out of her daughter's soccer game to come and talk to us today. It's really interesting as a birder to see the results of 3 years of tromping around in the mud and the rain and everything, to know how the data is being used and what we're going to be able to do going forward. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, and Kathleen, thank you. You were one of our most dedicated volunteers over the past few years. So we really appreciate everything that you've contributed. And I'm sure you'll still want to go out and do survey work with Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great thing to do.
Yeah, you see cool stuff. I think I need to unshare. Oh, does someone else have a question?
Yeah, so Susan, this is Jackson with Sea Grant. I had a just quick question, comment, just introduce myself too. Thanks for presenting. That was a great presentation. I was just curious to hear a little more about your plans for the burrowing shrimp study that you mentioned at the end. And it sounded like that would be with Fish and Wildlife Service as well. Will Ritchie had mentioned that before. But yeah, curious to hear a little more about it. I think people in the audience would be interested too.
Yeah, so that, it is with Fish and Wildlife Service through the same process, the SSP program. And the refuge has always been really interested in bird response to the shrimp, and their ability to kind of engineer the environment. However, in this broad survey, we weren't really able to incorporate that because the spatial scale of the shrimp compared to the birds in this survey was off, and we didn't feel like we could accurately represent that. So what we did was, go ahead and ask kind of a slightly shifted question, and that is, are the shrimp actually impacting the energy or the food resources that are available to the birds, both in Willapa and Grays Harbor? So it's actually a collaboration with the Billy Frank Jr. National Wildlife Refuge Complex as well, because they have the Grays Harbor unit out there. And so what we're doing is simply, sampling in some of the areas that Brett and Jennifer are working. It's Ledbetter and then the southern part of Grays Harbor. So we're sampling to look at shrimp densities, and then looking at the available macrofauna in different depth layers of different core layers associated with these shrimp densities. And then the other thing we're looking at is the myofauna at the very top layer of the mudflat and the biofilm, because those are also resources that are really important to migratory birds. So basically linking those back to shrimp densities. So sampling basically across a range of shrimp densities to understand how shrimp might impact the invertebrate availability to different water bird and fish species. And it's very linked to, where a bird or a fish can forage. So that's why we're dividing things into these different, depth categories. We're looking at the top 2 millimeters. We're looking at the top 0 to 5 centimeters, the mid 5 to 10, and then all the way down to 20 centimeters to understand, what's available. And then we'll be calculating energy density that's available to different species of birds and fish. So it's a pretty focused study. That's in a nutshell, or maybe not a very good nutshell, but that's what it is in a long-winded way.
No, that's very helpful. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, I think that'll be a very useful one too for a lot of people. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's just really interesting for us, but I hope it's, and it has a lot more broad use. So.
This is Doug, and I can keep thinking of questions all day long, I think. But what I think maybe you could shed some light on the eelgrass issues that kind of come up pretty often. I know that in Puget Sound, everybody's looking for promoting eelgrass all the time. And I know down here, the oyster growers really don't want to promote the japonica at all. It causes a different catch of sediment down here, and takes away some of their oystering grounds. And I'm just wondering sort of where you come down on it. Dick Wilson, who does a lot of work down here in the Bay too. I don't know if you know Dick.
I've met him. Yeah, actually, I think he lets us survey from his house.
Yeah. So he's a pretty fascinating guy. But I talked to him recently, and he was for, and I may have gotten this wrong, but he was for eelgrass is bad because what you really like is the mud flats with the diatoms out there. So there's a variety of opinions about how to manage and even think about eelgrass. And I wondered if you had any opinions from your work.
Oh, I never have opinion. I'm agnostic. I mean, but I think, from the perspective of birds, that's one of the questions we're asking with the study is how are they responding to that invasive eelgrass? And, we're trying to do that by comparing mud flat that doesn't have it to, areas where it is. And, I just really don't know. It occupies kind of a different niche or area than the native eelgrass, which is typically a little bit more like subtidal. And this is more intertidal. And so, the shorebirds probably are encountering it more as they, forage in the intertidal areas. But, the effect it's having, I have no idea. And I hope that we'll be able to shed some light on that with this study. And I know there's other people on the phone that are huge experts on this who might want to weigh in on, their thoughts or not. But, there's certainly a lot of folks that could speak to that.
Well, we have a lot of time today, so I'm going to stick in one little light comment, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to jump in. But one of the things that I read recently was about a restaurant in, it was Spain or Portugal, where they were looking at trying to produce sustainable food. And one of the things that they thought was really one of the most nutritious things that they produced at their restaurant was Zoastra. Apparently the seeds are extremely nutritious. And it's just interesting to see that somebody was actually promoting that as one of the fine restaurants in Europe. So anyway, that's my comment. So anybody else wants to jump in, we'd be glad to have you.
Well, I just wanted to add that I know Dick Wilson is going to be really pleased to know that the burrowing shrimp energetic study is getting underway, because this is something that he and I have both felt was missing for a couple of decades, because shorebirds need such a precise, open habitat, and you have a shrimp come in that just completely changes it. So he'll be thrilled that that's going forward. And I'm sorry he's not on today. I'm going to be in touch with him later today, and I'll talk to him about this.
Great. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to, it's a great question. Maybe I'm biased, yes, but I'm very interested in it, I guess.